and welcome back to the 2020 Adult Industry Health Summit, presented by ourselves, Pineapple Support, and in connection with Pornhub and porn models. We've had on already our legal section with Corey and Larry Walters. If you have missed these items already, you can be able to pick them up afterwards, as we will be putting everything back online. At present, though, we were just about to hand over to Angie Gunn, which is one of our fantastic therapists, and she is going to be presenting a definition on trauma. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Angie. Thank you ever so much, and do enjoy, everyone. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you so much, Pineapple Support, for having me. And I've really loved the opportunity to work with your clients and to have the beautiful expression of my gifts in terms of, I don't know if all of you know this, but I do both sex work and therapy, which is a complex balance of identities to navigate. And I'm really grateful that I get to do this work with other folks in the industry. I'm going to share my screen if someone can let me do that, so that I can show you a couple of slides. I think I'm a pretty visual learner, and I think that many of you might be as well. So I'm going to show a couple of images that will help with understanding how trauma plays out in our neurobiology. I'll try not to get it too long-winded, but give just a little bit of a teaser. I would really love this to be interactive. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, please write them in the chat and we will get them addressed. Just as I start digging in, are there any specific questions that folks have before we even jump in? Any specific areas of trauma you're interested in or wanting to make sure that I touch on in terms of definition, or any general questions that you might have? I'll give folks a second to think about that while I share my screen. One of the things that we talk about with trauma is the importance of body orientation. So being able to track what your body is doing, because often in trauma reactivity, your body is the first thing to respond. So before your brain even is online to understand oh, something bad's coming at me, your body is already reacting and protecting you. So even just in this moment, sometimes when I'm presenting, you notice I'll take a deep breath and just notice what my body's needing and tracking, which I encourage you to do right now too, if you're having anything come up. Okay, so I'll jump in and feel free to ask questions along the way. No pressure to do so right now. So I want to have a little bit of an activity to have you start thinking about what it can feel like to be moving through trauma activation. So when you see this star, this is a tool from Peter Levine's somatic experiencing model. And the theory is that trauma is stored in our bodies in 5 specific ways. So we have 5 different types of memory systems that stores trauma. And often when we're experiencing it, the memories will disperse. So it's kind of like you imagine a really fancy set of drawers. The somatic, which is the body memories, are put in one drawer. The meaning or the story is put in a different drawer. Images are way in the corner. Affect may be in a really entirely different room, which is the emotion. And behavior might be really hard to access as well. So what we try to do is bring these 5 elements together to try to anchor an integration and give you the opportunity to witness your experience in a moment by combining these elements. So I want you to think about, actually we'll do this with a happy thing first. Think about something that's really beautiful, a place that you really enjoy, something that feels really safe to you. I am currently in Idaho and it's snowing. So I'm dreaming of beaches lately. So thinking about, if I'm on the beach, what can I feel in my body? What images do I see? What stories am I thinking of? What emotions am I noticing? What behavior am I engaging in? And when we ground in our senses, we give our bodies a chance to remember what it feels like to be in that place at a very physical level. And it helps us to come back to safety and grounding. So even just throughout this conversation, if at any point you're feeling distressed or activated or something feels hard, feel free to use this tool and think about the ways in which your body can anchor, and that ultimately you are in control of those reactions. Even when it's hard to shift it might take time to learn, but you are able to engage with your trauma directly and change the way your body is experiencing it through practice. And we'll talk about how. So before we get into more of the practice things, I'm going to give you a little bit more definitional stuff. Excuse me. Easiest way to think about trauma is stress that overwhelms your body's ability to cope. So the actual trauma is the stressor, is the thing that's happening that is resulting in the difficulty in coping. But when it is in our bodies, it gets really complicated because our bodies are reacting to something that may or may not be real anymore because of the way it's stored. And so it's helpful to think about the trauma as not organic to your body. It's not coming from inside of you, but it is your body's survival strategy to cope with that trauma, that impact. So your body is always trying to seek safety through automatic responses at every level. So before your brain is even engaged, your body is trying to figure out how to keep you safe, which is pretty fucking cool when it comes to bodies, but pretty frustrating when it's a time that you don't want it to be reacting. So I had a really beautiful experience with a lover once who I felt really safe and connected to and had a really great experience, but he just missed a little and hit really hard at the wrong angle on my near my butthole, just gonna be direct, hit at the wrong angle, and I had a vasovagal reaction, which we'll talk about what that is. But my body went into a trauma response. I was shutting down, sweating, shaking, my vision was blurry, intense pain, and my body was trying to protect me, right? And my body was telling me that I needed to like get small as if I was being like attacked by a lion. Just a big dick, not a lion. So that activation, that kind of like shutting in and closing in, was my body trying to figure out what it could do with this intense sensory response, even though it wasn't a trauma that was happening in that moment. So our bodies are very savvy, which is a nice thing, but sometimes unpredictable. A really important thing we want to talk about is the ways in which, when I say that in this slide, that trauma is not yours, often it is not organic to you, right? It is not a dysfunction in you. It is nothing bad or broken about you, but it is the impact of all of the stressors around us. When we think about stressors, we want to think about oppression as one of those. So if you are somebody who is of a different identity, that is not the dominant kind of like ruling population, basically if you're not cis, heterosexual, and white, you are likely experiencing trauma as a result of your identities. And this is particularly true for sex workers because by default of being in this industry, you are experiencing trauma from stigma and shame and oppression that's coming at you from all sides, be it social media, legal spaces, partner spaces, family spaces. So it's really challenging in this industry because we're inherently experiencing trauma, not because the work is bad, but because the way that the world sees the work is bad. And that's really unfortunate. So if you look at this little chart, it goes through some of the different places where oppression can come in. And all of these can be basically sources of trauma. And I have another slide that will talk a little more about that. Okay, I know this is a lot of fucking words, so no need to read all of it. I'll give you a little summary. But I wanted to break down the types of trauma a little bit more specifically. So when we think about trauma as stressors that overwhelm, what are those stressors? The first type that I put on here is acute crisis trauma. So like, what's happening in your life right now? Like, are you being bullied at work in a club setting? Are you having difficulty in your family? Are you currently with a partner who's unsafe? That experience of acute crisis trauma is a very different experience in our body because it means that we don't have a safe base to go to. Every day we're feeling that activation. Second type is developmental trauma. So this is basically trauma that happened over the course of your childhood. This can be neglect, can be abuse, can be moving around a lot, changing caregivers, any kind of harm that meant that your early nervous system as a child shifted its relationship to well-being and had to learn new ways to survive because you weren't being cared for in the way that maybe would have been better. Third type is relational trauma. So this is basically any harm experienced in a close relationship, including partners, friendships, family members. And this relational trauma is really complex because oftentimes like there's really beautiful things in the relationship too. Like you might feel really like at times feel really close and connected and safe and loved. But your body is also being harmed in some way, be it emotional or psychological or sexual. And so honoring that relational trauma is some of the most intense because it is happening in a way that confuses our nervous system. We both are seeking this person, like I want to be with them, I want to see them, I want to feel close to them because they nourish this one part of me, but I'm also being harmed. And so our nervous systems have a hard time in this trauma specifically. The fourth type is intergenerational or historical trauma. This is basically like all the shit that's happened in our systems. When you think about historical racism, think about sexism, think about whorephobia, think about all the ways in which parts of your identities have been oppressed for many generations. And that is stored in our nervous system in the form of epigenetics, which are basically like little cells in your DNA that can, in your genes that can turn on and off. And we can trigger the on or off response by memory systems that are stored and transferred by our families. So basically, like, easiest example is a cat is always terrifying to mice because they have an epigenetic storage memory of cats being terrifying to keep them safe. And there's the belief that humans have the same kind of like memory system, like great example with racism, that white people are chronically unsafe forever because it's deeply stored in the bodies of Black and Brown Americans, for example, and other countries as well. Identity trauma, this is harm experienced because of an identity, so it can be interrelated with historical and systemic trauma. But this is any kind of hate or discrimination or harm that's coming at you because of your identity. And this can be ongoing, can be happening every day, unfortunately. This is big for sex workers, again, because of the nature of this job and the ways in which the world treats sex work, unfortunately. Anticipatory trauma is activation arising out of impending harm. So this is kind of what we call triggers. When people talk about triggers, it's basically that, like, I think something bad is going to happen. It's not that you said something shitty to me, but it's that, like, my body is having this activation because it believes that because you said something shitty, that means I'm about to get hit, or that means that something bad is going to happen next. And then complex trauma is usually a good catch-all. It's the compounding of all of these traumas together and snowballing on multiple traumas over time. Okay, I'm saying a bunch of words. Any questions, thoughts, any reflections coming in? Okay, feel free to jump in as you see things. So now we'll jump into a little bit more of the neurobiology, like what's happening in your brain. So attachment is highly linked to trauma patterns, and so we'll talk about attachment as well. When you think about attachment neurobiology, this is the process. So a typical infant goes through this cycle where they have a need, express the need, crying, screaming, whatever. The need is met by a caregiver, and the child calms down. The typical infant goes through this cycle 50 to 100 times a day. And through this cycle, it develops the sense of predictability, consistency, safety through reciprocity and resonance. So lots of words just to say that the kid feels safe, feels held, kid feels cared for, and kid begins to believe that they're literally the lower half of their brain is beginning to develop and learn that the world is safe for me. I can be held and cared for and connected, and my needs will always be met. Very few humans have this in a meaningful way, unfortunately. So I think there's very few people that really have a secure attachment. And one of the challenges that come with that is that even if somebody had a pretty healthy, normal developmental trajectory as a child, every subsequent relationship will impact our attachment style as well, right? Because when we leave our parents' care, we're then inputting partners into the cycle. And ultimately, our partners are not going to meet this cycle well because they're not our caregiver, right? And ultimately, it's our job to figure out how to take over this pattern. And we'll talk about more why that's important in just a second. When you think about those cycles, that same attachment pattern then is playing out in relationships. And when there is harm in, as we just talked about, the layers of oppression, when we think about harm coming from your home, harm in your community, or harm in the global structures, specifically related to sex work, all of that means that it's hard to feel safe anywhere. And it doesn't really feel like home anywhere, because our binding is it's much bigger than you. That's the thing that I always tell clients, is that it's not you. There's no function in you. It is the system you've been and the ways in which you've been able to show up in the world, that it's not your fault. You have externally help willing, because then you can learn that I am not the dysfunction, right? It's the systems that are broken. I think workers tend to know that more than anybody, that the systems are really fucking broken. Happening at our brain level. Our brain goes through 3 core response cycles when it's trying to interpret trauma. So you can imagine a threat of some sort. Maybe it's a client, stranger on the street, someone's coming at you. The first thing your brain's gonna do is orient. It's gonna try to figure out, is this person, is this thing a threat? And that involves 2 main brain functions: the amygdala, which is the emotional part of your brain, and it's pretty impulsive. It's gonna just have a quick reaction, like, oh fuck, the person's running or screaming, I better hide, right? The second part is your ventral vagus nerve, which is higher definition, and it reads the situation and uses others' expressions to regulate or gauge danger, which basically means it looks around for social cues. So you're in a mall and somebody, weird to think of being in a mall right now during COVID. You're in a mall and someone comes at you, you're gonna look around first and see, are other people running? Do they look scared? What should I be doing? Right, so the ventral vagus nerve is searching for social cues, facial expression, body language, things like that. Second response is mobilizing. So after your brain is oriented and is like, oh, yeah, that's a threat, then your brain's gonna mobilize. And that's a dorsal vagal response, which is the oldest response that we share with other mammals. Basically shut down, faint, freeze, curl in a ball and hide, which is difficult if that's happening when you're, at work or with a partner, but certainly like that's a common response in that moment. The second mobilizing response is instead of shutting down, ramping up, which is your HPA axis releases cortisol and signals to your body to fight or flight. So you're just gonna run, get away, which again will be awkward during sex or work, a thing to work on. The third level response is immobilizing, which is your hippocampus inhibiting the HPA axis to calm and store information. And then your ventral vagal response, the same one as above, coming back around to calm and regulate your body. So like, hey, we're fine, everything's safe, we're here. And then literally your frontal lobe, which is the smart part of your brain, is offline until you're calm again. So you can't use reasoning in the same way that we would in other contexts. We have to literally learn our body's reactions at this baser level in order to manage how to move through these. Okay. This is another example of what's happening in your body. So the 2 cycles I just talked about, the shutting down is the parasympathetic, similar to rest and digest. So both shutting down to hide as well as shutting down to calm is a similar response. Sympathetic, the fight or flight, is the ramping up activation. And these are some of the things that happen in your body in those stages. And you notice that they do impact sexual functioning, which we've mentioned already. Okay, here's one more little chart then to explain kind of what those reactions can look like. So you imagine everyone has a baseline in their nervous system, which is basically like your nervous system is a electrical wave. So you can imagine this blue wave is kind of like a normal nervous system. Nobody's normal, but this is the visual of what that could look like. The middle pink line that looks kind of like a heartbeat is what would be called maybe a single incident or trigger activation. So generally our bodies want to stay within this window of tolerance, which is that blue dotted line. As soon as we're going outside that window, our bodies are having a much harder time coping. It's much more activating, much more difficult to stay engaged. And so what happens though with somebody with complex trauma or oppression related trauma, all the categories we just talked about, is it's often true that because you've been in survival mode for so long, maybe you've been always on for your whole life. So your baseline is, instead of it being that blue line, your baseline might be this red line, which means that you are often always activated. And I added this little scale on the side here to start tracking. If you want to start noticing what your activation patterns are like and keeping track of it, that can help with understanding your nervous system specifically. So when you're always on, these are some of the common responses that come in, compared to others who are always stuck off, might have a really low baseline. This is more folks with depression, dissociation, numbness, that kind of thing. Whereas the always on folks tend to be more like anxiety, rage kind of patterns. But you notice there's really high impact on your bodies. Trauma-related responses are significantly linked to autoimmune disorders, highly linked to problems with food and food management, problems with pain, problems with heart rate, managing just basic well-being, because our bodies are always trying to protect us and keep us alive, which means they don't ever get to work on kind of basic functioning, which is a pretty frustrating response sometimes. But there is ways to move through it, and part of it is that knowing what are your patterns, right? Do you know what it feels like to be at baseline? Do you know what it feels like to be quickly fluctuating between on and off? Do you know what causes that? What are some common points of activation for you? Maybe it's certain places, maybe it's certain people, maybe it's certain memories, right? So the more awareness you get of yourselves and you're orienting in your body, the more awareness you can get to how to manage those patterns. I keep throwing lots of words at you. Any questions, anybody? It's really hard not seeing anyone's faces. Just imagining this beautiful abyss of sexy humans watching. Okay. One way to notice some of your patterns, specifically in relationship trauma, is to use this scale, which is, you can think about the x-axis, this low anxiety to high anxiety, as the axis that you manage, are you okay with yourself? Right, so if you're pretty low anxiety, you're like, I'm awesome, I'm rad, like, I think I'm lovable and wanted and I'm great, like low anxiety. High anxiety is the, what the fuck am I doing? Where am I? Who am I? The kind of like, I'm not okay within me. And then the avoidance scale is the okayness with other people. So low avoidance, like, I just met you and now we're best friends and I'm gonna come over tomorrow and we're gonna work together. Compared to high avoidance is, fuck no, I might be your friend on Instagram and 2 years later, maybe we'll meet, right? So safety with yourself, safety with other people. And so knowing kind of how you relate in those spaces, these are kind of the more common attachment language that you'll hear. And it's way more about your relationship to yourself and others, and less about you are being always avoidant or always anxious. One of the ways that we really address trauma is using regulation and relationship. And I think there's another course after this that'll talk about some strategies, so I won't go into as much detail, but you can work on healing those dynamics by having a partner help you know your fluctuations and watch those fluctuations, and also have help you with learning what your safety anchor is. So we need to feel both safe in ourselves, because at times our partners aren't around us, safe in ourselves, and also safe in relationship, which are two things that are really hard to do when you've had trauma experiences. But finding like, where's your safety anchor? Maybe you hide under a blanket and smoke a bunch of weed and get to, masturbate and be in your body. That's your safety anchor. Maybe it is time with friends, maybe it's time in nature. What are the places and the visions and the thoughts that help you feel really safe and grounded? And can you access those when you're activated during other times, right? You're having a trauma reaction in a workplace. Can you call up your own safety in your body and get back to that connection? And then with a partner, can your partner learn to hold you and your trauma in a safe and connected way? This can be the way that they help you with sexual exploration. This can be the way they relate to you in your work. I think it's a really big deal in terms of being in sex work and having partners that are on board, partners that get it, partners that support it. I know that it's really fucking hard to find, but partners that really see you fully and want to understand and connect with all the parts of you, including the parts that are traumatized, including the parts that love the work, but don't like the way the world treats it. The parts of you that feel the most, your biggest, most expansive when you're doing a scene, and yet the most shut down when someone says some shit on the internet, right? So we need people that can hold all that, even if it's just friendship. We need other humans to reflect back, because the most common regulation, thinking back to that baby and the mom in attachment cycles, the most common regulation happens in relationship, right? When we're feeling close and safe, our nervous system can calm down because it's getting permission from the cues from the other person. That's the most significant tactic. Important to do that in relationships. Knowing your boundaries is really big. So figuring out like, what are the ways in which you have violated your own boundaries, either in work or in relationships, and how that has exacerbated trauma, and how do you get better at figuring out what those are. Sex work has been one of the things that has taught me boundaries more than anything else in my life. It's constantly a reinforcement of the more boundary I am, the more enjoyment I have of the work, and the more I can manage potential harm that might come from it. And learn to listen to your body's safety cues, right? If you're getting that gut instinct, like this isn't feeling good, like that's a great place to ground in and stay connected to you, and always trust your body's cues. Cool, I think I talked about all those things. Diversify your anchors, have more than one person, have as many people as you can that can help with supporting you, and have space for rupture and repair, right? Working through conflict is a big part of healing, because we can then learn like, oh wait, I can go through some shit with this person and come back, and we can stay in connection. We can still feel love and support. And that's really big for feeling connected. And then, yeah, making and keeping agreements is a big part of building trust. So whether it's a workplace relationship or friendship or partnership, what are the agreements you're making, and can you keep them with each other so that you can build that cycle of predictability, consistency, and safety? And this is a little tool that I developed to help with moving through a trauma activation that's coming in. So this is if it's happening in a sexual space, but can also be applied in other places in terms of just conversation. But you're really giving yourself permission to go really slow and pace how you might relate to touch and connection in that moment, right? So you're letting your body give you feedback continuously. And the more cued in you are to that, noticing it and kind of like dip your toe in the water and then pull back to safety, and then go a little further and then pull back. You're letting, they call this process titration, which is giving yourself permission to slowly experience a maybe traumatizing or activating event, but doing so in a way that you feel safe and connected. And so you can apply this model to a lot of different ways that you might want to do that in the community and your life. But may come in with a client. And it's harder to do, I think, in sex work spaces where our clients are paying us. And so we're not always in the space where we can have conversations about our emotional well-being, because we maybe separated that part. But at least with partners and other kinds of folks, it's really important to get their buy-in into the process with you. Okay, those are all the words I had. But I'd love to hear from all of you. Any slides that you want to see again, anything more you want conversations about? I know this is kind of fast, so just a really brief overview, and I want to make sure that I give you what you need today.